Calvary Cast listeners, we're back. Episode 152 coming into your earbuds today. I am Graham. He is Jess. And back again, repeat, Matthew Anderson. What's your middle name?
James.
Matthew James Anderson. Do you have a junior, senior, or like a fourth? Or
No, that's it.
Okay.
That's it. That's too many. That's already too long to fit on a driver's license anyway.
Matthew Anderson is too long?
Or James as well. I don't know.
Okay. I don't know
Could
how
be
they do
longer.
it in down under.
Do they have driver's license in Australia?
Oh, we do. We do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you...
Do you have electricity and running water?
That's right.
Did I ask you last
right.
time, have you ever gotten in a fight with a kangaroo?
Yeah, that went down
so
well.
last
Yeah.
We covered that.
Yeah.
So, feedback from last time's episode,
good.
a little bit, okay?
Well, I got invited back, so it kind of gone too bad.
Yeah, no, you're a good conversation partner.
Good.
The kangaroo conversation was a favorite.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
Yep, the kangaroo conversation. And then my brother texted, and I shared this with you, that he's like, it doesn't make any sense, but the accent makes you guys sound more intelligent. So there we go.
Accents usually do, unless they're Southern accents.
Yeah, I was going to
but
say
we
that
won't go there.
I do not understand that, but
This is a
I'll
very
take it
Southern
though.
accent.
Yeah, that's right. I'm on the southern end of Australia, but that's the more posh end, I think. So.
Right.
I want to know, if we were on an Australian podcast, would we provide the same...
Do they have podcasts in Australia?
We do. We get there, but you have to like ride a bike to the local post office and pick them up.
Have you guys discovered penicillin yet?
I think no, that was invented. Wasn't that Howard Florey who invented that?
I have no
he was
clue.
he was an Australian. I think, who invented that.
Wow.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the other feedback I got is we are being shadow banned potentially, because I had talked about how on the last episode that our interaction on social media over the reel we share with the clip from the show had nothing. So we're being shadow banned. And then Bill texted me, he said, I liked your video on YouTube and it didn't reflect the like. And then he showed me, it even had the like thing and it still said 0.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a conspiracy out there.
Wow.
I don't know who
Is
it
it,
is.
so is this just for YouTube?
I don't know.
So there's a
Surely not.
shadowy office in Salt Lake City with a bunch of guys clicking buttons
So
and stopping us.
Elon needs to buy YouTube.
Elon needs to buy YouTube.
We need Elon to buy YouTube. Well, we really need to figure that out, too, because we got to figure out what's going on with that.
I don't know. We did get a bunch of...
If there's just certain words where we
shouldn't
say or
like,
whatever that's going to flag
the
us.
Bible, Christianity,
Yeah, sin.
sin, things like that. That could be the flag words, and it's going to be hard to do this podcast without those things. So
I suppose.
anyway, well, we just completed before this another episode for our Patreon subscribers, meaning the three of us talking about things that we find fascinating and nerdy and weird, and nobody else would. So anyway. Well, that was hit like a lead brick.
I wasn't listening. I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I tuned out for a second. I was thinking about the... Yeah, anyway.
Oh, we do. Jess has his emotional support animal with us today. So if you hear a yep in the background.
Or a whine or other noises that he makes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
But you're
his-
going to be a lot calmer for this
I will.
podcast
I
than
feel
last
so
time.
relaxed.
Just much
because my
more
emotional
gentle.
support dog
Yeah.
is here with me.
Until he poops on the floor.
We're
like,
stressed out.
ah! Anyway, let's get into the topic of the day.
Topic of the day.
All right. Topic of the day. I have done a lot of research on this, so I hope the people are ready. But this is, can faith and science coexist? And by a lot of research, I mean I have read the questions that were sent to me. So we have
fine.
Matthew James Anderson here, who is, to a degree, you're a scientist.
Yeah, I have worked
Or
as
am-
a scientist.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, now what does it, this is unrelated, what qualifies one to say they are a scientist and have worked as a scientist?
So, like, you've done the research, you've read the questions, and you've gone off script already. No, that's fine. No, good question. It's thrown out a lot. Well, I mean, I've got a degree in science, or biotechnology is my degree, and then I've worked in medical research science for a few years. I don't have my PhD though. There are plenty of scientists more qualified than I am. but I guess I would say more than just a quick Google search might qualify one to be a scientist.
So you're saying the amount of research I've done does not count as being a scientist?
I don't think you'd be able to put that on the census form. Or anything
Probably
like
not.
that. Yeah.
I don't do we do that? Do we put those on census forms here? I don't know either. So you're a scientist, but you're also a pastor at heart, and you have a degree in theology. And so we're going to talk about the science and the Bible.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is good. Now, this is a conversation that is not, I'm going to be honest, not my favorite conversation.
Yep.
And that's why we're having you on here, to help us make it more of my favorite.
Right. Okay. I was going to say you can zone out and I'll move away. But
yeah,
no, I think hopefully by the end you'll see the importance of it. But it also might depend on the type of people that you're dealing with,
Yes.
the type of questions that come up, and why it's important to reconcile faith and science.
And I think that there is some of those things, like contextually, you come across different things and you go and research and you become interested in those things. I still don't think I can ever get interested in dinosaurs or geology, which a lot of my like experience in like creationism and stuff is about dinosaurs and geology. I'm like,
You've seen Jurassic Park. You've seen how that went down. Don't want anything to do with that.
yeah. I've actually not seen the original Jurassic Park. I've seen the newer one, and it was So anyway, okay. So we've talked a little bit about your background.
Yep.
And let's ask this: what piqued your interest in these things?
Yeah. Well, we kind of already touched on it, I would say the necessity of getting into it. So I studied science in high school. We split into biology, chemistry, physics, maths, things like that. I went down more the branch of biology and chemistry for university. I was probably better at maths and physics, but there's more jobs in biology and chemistry kind of labs. I think maths is just to become a maths teacher and teach the next generation to use it. And sorry to all the mathematicians listening, I've offended them now. But
we have a big subculture,
right, a Belgian one.
yeah.
But I think doing a science degree right at the time of the peak of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, the new atheism, supposedly, even though there weren't many new arguments, the kind of questions that you would get from your lecturers, your fellow students, and then working in a science lab as well was probably better than the universities, as far as less antagonistic, but a million questions about the Bible, about faith, about science, about evolution, about every imaginable apologetic topic, and I kind of was forced into getting into apologetics because when you've got your mission field, the friends that you want to witness to, continually firing these questions at you, well, then you better find answers to them. So I had to get into it, I think.
You were forced to come up with some answers because you were being confronted with things that you're like, I know I don't agree with that, and I'm being challenged on these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do I find answers for it?
Yep.
Okay, so that sets us up a little bit. So we want to ask the question then, is there a conflict between faith and science?
Yeah.
Because people want to set those things at odds. Now, I'm going to interject with this for a minute. And I don't know if it was this way in Australia, but especially during COVID, we saw this. And it kind of became a mocking thing from some, especially on the right, to science, the science, right? Like
trust the science.
Trust the science. The science is the God. And there's actually, right there, they answer the question, is there a conflict between faith and science? No, because they're putting a lot of faith in their science, even when it doesn't have the conclusions that they want it to have.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm taking that off
that's
a different direction.
Already an interesting point. Maybe there's already an historical shift yet again as far as a trust in mainstream science. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. You don't want... I would take issue with hyper-skepticism of mistrusting everything and ignoring experts, but then a blind allegiance and obedience to, well, this is what the experts or scientists say, therefore I won't examine it or study it myself, which that's where I'd say historical science hasn't actually had, it's the motivation has been discovery of the truth, and that's the end goal, and I think there's been less biases then that's led to better science.
Yeah. Well, okay, I think some of this is science has been redefined, right?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
And where science, it was as a search for the truth, and you followed a set, the scientific method or whatever it is, to come to whatever that path led you down were the conclusions. Now, and we're kind of off topic a little bit, but we're going down a certain path, and the answers are telling us things that we don't like, and therefore we still stick with our preconceived idea as
very much so,
science.
which is the definition of poor science. So,
Right.
But so as far as back to the conflict between faith and science, or the supposed conflict, that's a relatively new concept.
Yeah.
And it's one that historically wouldn't have made sense to the early developers of the scientific method, and Newton and Kepler and Pascal and guys like that, because science as we understand it today in the modern West developed in the Christian West, and not as a coincidence. It just happened to develop in the West, or it happened to develop in Christian Europe. I would say it was specifically because it was Christian that it led to greater advancements in science. And there's definitely, in Asia and the Middle East, there were definitely scientific advancements, but not to the same degree as the West. And there's a guy called Whitehead's thesis. He believes that it's specifically because it was Christian that it led to the development of science. And I would see that they believed, and you can look at the original writings of Isaac Newton and guys like that, they believed God is a God of law and order, and he's a creator God, and he's a consistent, unchanging God, and that should be reflected in the creation.
Yeah.
And so we should expect to see laws that govern the universe, because that is how God operates. And not only that, but God has created us to discover that truth, because the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. So therefore we should be able to examine the heavens, study it deeper, find things that will glorify God. Probably thirdly, he's given us brains that are able to understand the intelligible universe. If you just come at it from a non-Christian worldview, so if you're an atheist, well, what reason do you have to trust your cognitive faculties? Why should I trust my brain? Why should I believe that the universe is intelligible? It's the Christian worldview that goes, not only are there laws that govern this, but they were created for us to discover them and understand them and glorify God in response. And also just the unchanging nature of God means the unchanging nature of the laws. If you look at what the Greeks believed about the Greek gods, they were changing. They could be playing tricks on you. You pick up a ball and drop it, you pick up a ball and drop it again, and we'll discover maybe there's some kind of gravitational force pulling it down. But in the ancient Greek world, well, it fell because the gods made it fall. But then the next time you do it, well, he might choose to do something different. So there's no consistency in it. It could be an ever-changing concept. So you can't discover laws if it's up to just the ever-changing will of the gods. Whereas, we believe in a consistent universe.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. I do find like the intelligent design argument really fascinating, and finding like structure and it's the conclusions that some of the like guys like Stephen Meyer and such are coming to is that there's no way there isn't an intelligent designer behind this. And it's really I listened to an interview with him a while back, but really destroying the notion of evolutionary biology.
Yep. And so I think that's a good segue into the reason why that's changed, because historically science and faith perfectly can coexist. The reason why that's changed now is, I believe, under some false assumptions, which is, and there's an element of truth that religious people in the past could sometimes use a god of the gaps.
Sure.
Why did this lightning fall down? Well, the gods are angry, lightning struck.
Right.
And now we understand why there's lightning. Okay, well, it wasn't a direct act of God. It was, there are natural forces in process, and now we understand them, and we can rule out the god of thunder or Thor or something like that. But as far as current, and I would say biblical Christianity and current day intelligent design theory, none of it is, and this is if you listen to any debate with Neil deGrasse Tyson and guys like that, they'll say, we once didn't understand how life came about, and so we put it down to God, but now we've discovered evolution and we've filled in that gap. But now the Christians are saying, well, but where did the universe come from? Where did the first cell come from? Oh, we don't know. Well, it must have been God. But I've never heard any Christian argue, I don't understand how this works, therefore God did it. It's actually the opposite. And for me, as I began to study, that was first and second year uni, we got into all the molecular machines and, the ATP, synthase, protein, these little mechanical, well, not biological motors that spinning at 40,000
Yes.
RPM and can stop within a quarter of a turn and rotate the other way. That's the bacterial flagellum. They have a clutch mechanism to come out of gear. It's not that I don't understand it that leads me to believe it's designed. It's the more I understand it, the more obvious it is that it's designed.
Right.
In the same way that if there are people who are convinced that a car is designed and someone's convinced that they're not designed and that they just came about with a tornado going through a scrap heap and bam, there's a car. The mechanic who figures out every little detail of how that car works and how the fuel gets injected in and the spark plug goes off and ignites the fuel and that causes the propulsion of the crankshaft, all of that, the more you understand it, the more obvious it is that it's designed.
Right.
So I just reject the idea that creationists are holding onto this God of the gaps.
Especially in light of the evidence.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're talking about that little tiny cell that's so complex that there's no way that it could ever have happened by chance.
Yeah.
Right? There has to be a designer behind it or just evolved to be that thing.
Well, isn't it interesting though? Like, because I grew up in public school, and then I got my degree from a public college. And when you would start your science class, especially when I remember this most clearly in college, you'd go into biology, freshman year or whatever, biology, and the first lecture is on there's no God. Essentially, this is the message that comes forward. And we're going to, we don't care what you believe outside of here, but this is what we're going to teach you, that there's no God and the evolutionary theory. And that right there, if you're training people in science, and that's essentially the first class and the first chapter of the science textbook, that's going to set them on a trajectory that's approaching science and seeing things different than if the way you just described science, I would have been interested from day one.
Yeah.
Like especially when I was a Christian, like I'd been like, oh yeah, this is great. Okay, let's get going. Let's see how God did things. But just the way that it's presented differently, which could be a case for Christian education.
Yeah.
Because if your kids are going to a school where that is how they're being trained, you have to be really aggressive when they get home and showing them, especially in the realm of science, right? Am I right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what makes it good science, and what we've seen historically is those that believed the starting point, that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and that's our foundation for science. I don't think the atheistic worldview provides enough motivation or clarity, or even just a proper framework for there to be good science. Even just we need to understand our senses and that the universe is intelligible. Well, says who? We don't have a framework for that. And I think that probably the current day problem is not so much the idea of science, but the idea of scientism, which is the belief that I will only believe something if you can prove it to me scientifically. And which I would say, your belief in that the scientific method is the only way of discovering truth, can you prove that scientifically? It's self-defeating. Yeah. I'll only accept scientific evidence. Prove to me scientifically that you can only accept scientific evidence.
Right.
And I mean, there's all sorts of things that we believe about morality, about history, about science, about philosophy, all sorts of things that are not scientific. But in our modern day, if you say something is unscientific or not scientific, it's synonymous with saying it's not true.
Right. Well, and because what I think we're increasingly seeing, what is called science has a definite moral element.
Yeah, which makes no sense in an atheistic, purely scientism kind of field. Well, that makes no sense. And so I think you actually make for better scientists when you understand science is amazing, it's great, and it has its place. It's for studying the natural world. And so some atheist scientists get it. Well, he's probably more agnostic. So Stephen Jay Gould was a famous American paleontologist. He called science and faith, it was NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, which means they're their own realms. Science can stick with science, philosophy and theology can stick with their own side. And I kind of agree as far as science doesn't have much to say about proving the supernatural. The problem is kind of what he meant by that was leave us alone, we'll do our own thing, in which I would say, actually, no, you do need theology, you do need God and faith as a foundation for your science, But my issue is when you make the assumption that science can be its own little thing off on its own. I'm just going to look at the scientific evidence, because you're already presupposing, say, that God doesn't exist, which is a poor presupposition. My issue has been, and I've had lecturers and workmates in labs talk to me about this. They go, I would happily believe in God, you just need to show me the evidence. And I would normally follow up by asking, well, what kind of evidence are you looking for? Or I don't know, you show me the evidence. I go, sure, I'm more than happy to if you explain to me what type of evidence. They haven't thought far enough to go, well, what type of evidence I'm looking for. And they go, oh, well, scientific evidence. Well, why would you be looking, if science is the study of the natural world, why would you be looking for naturalistic evidence of the supernatural? You're already ruling out God right from the outset, and then are shocked when you don't discover any evidence. I go, well, of course you wouldn't, because you're only looking within the realm of science, in the same way that, I'll go, prove to me that murder is wrong, but I'll only accept scientific evidence, not moral evidence, not philosophy, not theology, not revelatory evidence from the Bible. I'll only accept the realm of science. Well, good luck proving to me that murder is wrong, because you're looking in the wrong field.
Right.
So.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating to think about. So there's no conflict between faith and science.
No, I don't think so. If it's defined correctly,
right.
I think is part of the issue, and you recognise that they are separate and they have their own place. It's for studying the natural world, and theology is the study of the supernatural. But not only do I not see a conflict, I see the design and the necessity of God for underpinning science as they can work together while still being separate. But there's no contradiction.
And your presuppositions about the world, your theological presuppositions, your faith, if you want to use that, that's kind of also how you interpret some of the data that you are seeing through the scientific method, right?
Yeah, which is interesting, Jesse. You mentioned that the starting point was, okay, there's no God. All right. Let's move on and discover the world. And
yes,
that's a very interesting take, and I think a poor way of starting, for a variety of reasons. I guess I hold to the biblical worldview, and that is my starting point. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. As far as the modern day conflict between faith and science, or supposed conflict, that's come about more so since Darwin.
Right.
And so the modern day rejection that I got in labs and in classes was, how could you believe the Bible? Straight to creation, evolution, Noah's, the worldwide flood, the age of the earth. They're kind of the big deals. Right. And why they would say, I can't believe the Bible because we know that science teaches this and the Bible teaches that. Well, I'm going to pick science over the Bible.
Yeah.
That is exactly the problem. And I won't go into all the details because there's dozens of books that you could go into. And there's heaps of different topics within that, as far as creation, evolution, the age of the earth, carbon dating, genetics, fossil record, you name it. We can go down any number of rabbit trails. I would, as far as briefly covering those things, you've already hit the nail on the head, which is the way in which we view the evidence shapes what we can, what we conclude.
Right.
How do we approach
how
do we approach the evidence? And you can approach it with, I already know God doesn't exist. I already know the earth is old. I already know, we have to come up with a naturalistic explanation as to how we have all of this life on earth.
Right.
All I know for certain was it wasn't God. Let's come up with a naturalistic explanation. Oh, here's the theory. Oh, I can make the evidence fit. The problem that I have with that is that I can also make that same evidence also fit the biblical worldview. So then it comes down to, well, what's a more reasonable worldview? And so for something like a global flood versus the age of the earth, we can look at all the rock layers and say this was a little bit of water over a lot of time. I'm sounding like Ken Ham here, that it was slowly laid down over millions of years. And I can but I can come to that same evidence with my biblical worldview and say this was a lot of water over a little bit of time. Do we see evidence of a global flood? I would say absolutely. When you've got fossils scattered all throughout it, even at the top of mountains, there's fossilized fish, and there's polystrate fossils where you got fossilized trees coming up through millions of layers. I think that's more evidence of a catastrophe rather than a slow, long process. And then same with when it comes to animals. I see animals reproducing after their own kind. We see natural selection happening, which means there's all the genetic variation of let's just take your emotional support dog there. There was a dog kind that had all the genetics for a Great Dane and a Chihuahua and everything in between. And they got selected. Maybe that's less so natural selection as it was artificial selection there to get the.
Yeah, what's the point of a Chihuahua?
Yeah, that was since the fall, and things got corrupted, and there was mutations. Now we've offended the Chihuahua
I'm sorry,
listeners.
Chihuahua listeners.
So a lot of this is interpretation of data, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you have the data for science, which is the natural world,
Yeah,
and because they're coming to it with a presupposition that there is no God and that the Bible is false and there was no flood and all those kinds of things, they're immediately interpreting that data based on what their presupposition is. Whereas if we come to it, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, with the scriptures in hand, and specifically Genesis, we're going to interpret that data differently.
yeah.
Right.
And I'd say even some who don't come at it with atheistic presuppositions can still make the mistake of thinking there needs to be a naturalistic explanation. So even, say, the theistic evolutionist who says, I still want to know how this all came about, how did all the different species arrive, they're still trying to come up with a naturalistic explanation, which doesn't work if God just said,
Here's all the dogs.
Here's all the dogs, sort of thing. Let there be this, and he created it. So, which might be less intellectually satisfying to know how it all came about if you think there needs to be some kind of naturalistic explanation. But I think it doesn't change science for the most part, which is how do things work. Whereas evolution is a bit of a different one. It's the how did it come about, or it's the what happened historically. And even though we disagree on that, for me as a Christian and when I've worked as a scientist, I wasn't trying to discover what happened historically. I was trying to figure out how does this work. So for me, I was doing breast cancer research and what causes breast cancer cells to metastasize and enter the bloodstream. Well, none of that has to do with, did it evolve or didn't it, or was it created by God? We're looking at how does it work. That's the real on-the-grounds operational research. And I've never seen, bring it slightly back to the conflict of faith and science, but, I had several guys in the lab that I worked with who were all Bible-believing Christians, an elder at a church, and he was an amazing research scientist because he was interested in how does this work. And being a Christian doesn't stop you from questioning things and figuring out, I want to know how this cell works.
Yeah. So as Christians, we want to think about how does the Bible help us with science in those ways. Now, the Bible is clearly not a scientific textbook, just like it's not a math textbook or a finance textbook. But as we've already talked about, there's not this disconnect between faith and science, but there is the undergirding worldview perspective on how we interpret the naturalistic data, right? Would that be a good way to phrase that? So then we need to go to Genesis, which is the beginning of all things, and we need to go, okay, what is the Bible trying to teach us about creation, especially in Genesis, and especially in the first chapters, right? Chapters 1 through 3 especially, and then on from there. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think for every Christian, we should be concerned about what does the Bible say? What does it teach? And you're right that it's not a scientific textbook. That doesn't mean that it's in conflict with science. It just means what is the purpose behind these opening chapters of Genesis? It's to teach us about God. What do we learn about God? What do we learn about the world? I mean, the opening chapters of Genesis are really foundational for our biblical worldview. Mm-hmm. Why is the world the way that it is? And I mean, we can go into all that in a bit about, a perfect world marred by sin, things like that. But how we approach this text varies greatly as far as those opening few chapters are interpreted in a wide variety of ways. And for me, I've often been criticized for, and the quote is, you're taking it literally, sort of thing, which
you backwards.
I have no problem with that. But because the snarky responses you'll get is, but if you take that literally, what about all these other things where, Jesus said, I am the door, or I am the vine, or, in Revelation, there's going to be a beast with 10 horns and, was it 7 heads and 10 horns, and the stars are going to fall from the sky and hit the earth. And, well, if you take Genesis literally, well, then what do you do with Revelation or Jesus' parables? And I go, well, it's actually pretty simple. Taking it literally doesn't just mean reading it and having no clue about the context or the genre. It literally means, to the letter, It's referring to the literary genre that it is. Right. So for me to take the Bible literally is to recognize Genesis is written as history, Revelation is written as an apocalyptic epistle in which there are truths about the future of the earth, but there are also images. Symbols, images used. And I'm capable of, when Jesus says, I'm the door, I'm capable of recognizing when he's speaking in parables and using metaphors. I just don't see that in Genesis, the use of metaphors and imagery. I think it's revealing historical truths about how he made the earth. Yeah. And not just that, but there's spiritual and theological truths as well. But it is history.
A better question be about Genesis 1 would be like, say, is Genesis 1 through 11 historical truth? Would that be a better way to approach it?
Because that is where the debate lies, and even the term used for Genesis 1 to 11 in the academic circles is proto-history. They make a divide between Genesis 1 to 11 and 12 onwards once Abraham arrives. I would take issue with that, or even calling it proto-history or some kind of prehistory. I mean, I don't mind the fact they're calling it history, but the implication is that there's some kind of disconnect between Genesis 1 to 11 and the rest of Genesis. I would take issue with it because I don't see a massive textual change.
No.
The genre suddenly changes from one section to the next. It just flows on beautifully. I don't know why, in writing about God's dealing with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that the writer of Genesis, in making up some kind of foundational story, would go, well, let's just make up that Abraham's father was, begat by, who Abraham's father's father was. Right. And then suddenly that was all fictional. And then suddenly this real guy called Abraham comes along, even though we've detailed all of the history between Adam to Abraham. I'm not sure why that would be included in there. So it doesn't really make any sense.
No, it doesn't make any sense. And like you say, it doesn't make any sense as you read the story. And there's very clear, even textual things about like the genealogies, and it's obviously moving the story forward to get you to notice a specific character. That's why those genealogies are set up that way.
I was just going to say, it also makes it difficult as far as if we, sort of cast doubts upon those opening chapters, then why can't we do that with the rest of the Bible as well? If there are certain parts we go, well, that's not historical, that wasn't, really how it was, then why would we trust that Abraham's interactions with God from Genesis 12 onwards are not some kind of allegorical story that we can learn some spiritual meaning from, which I take massive issue with, because the reason why we learn about the character of God is because he has really intervened in history and dealt with these people. And if they're just nothing more than a nice metaphorical spiritual story for us to learn things from, I want a God who's real, not just based on fiction. And even just the rest of the Bible itself, which we can go into some of the theological problems later, but just Exodus 20, when God reveals himself through the Ten Commandments, he gives the Sabbath command that in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. That's why you work 6 days and rest on the seventh, because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. God himself is interpreting those opening chapters of Genesis as a literal event, to be taken at face value.
Well, and you see the same thing in the New Testament. We were talking earlier before we were recording about male-female roles in some degree, right? Paul is appealing back to a creational order.
Yeah.
And again, like you were talking earlier too about science, right? There's an order to the universe. There's an orderly God, and here you have an orderly account. Why would that be fictional?
Yeah, so you have Paul appealing back to it of Adam and Eve, so as literal historical figures. You even have Jesus when he's asked about divorce, and I think it's Mark 10 where he says, in the beginning, God made them male and female. Well, that doesn't work if actually, the universe was around for billions of years, and then, slowly this group of early hominids, rose up from the caves kind of thing, and then, then they weren't made male and female in the beginning of bacteria and the pre-human apes.
Yeah, and even Luke's lineage traces Jesus back to Adam.
Yeah.
And so everything before Abram that he puts in there, pointing to them being literal historical figures. He's literally descended from Adam.
Yeah, so then I guess that reveals our approach to scriptural interpretation, which is, do we look at Genesis 1 to 11 on its own and we come to it with our ideas of, well, I don't want the atheistic academics to mock me too much, even though they already don't think much of me for believing in a resurrection, but let's just reinterpret Genesis 1 to 11 based on my current understanding and my current biases, when actually the best interpreter of Scripture are the Scriptures themselves.
Yes.
So if Jesus and Paul and the Holy Spirit inspiring these letters take the first 11 chapters of Genesis seriously, well, then I'm going to do the same.
Yeah. Okay, we're talking a little bit about problems with not reading Genesis 1 to 11 historically. What and we've talked about a little bit of the problem of Adam and Eve and creation order and things like that. What are some other problems that come up with that?
So I think that the primary thing, which we've already touched on, is the reliability and authenticity of the Scriptures. A big one, and I kind of touched on it, of what those early humans were like. Were they Adam and Eve, or were they a group of primates that then slowly evolved and developed into what we now call humans? That's not what I see when the Bible says that we're created in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah.
I think that has massive ramifications for what it means to be an image bearer of God. And there are a variety of interpretations of what that actually entails. But I'd say pretty much all of them that I've seen, though, haven't entailed it's slowly developing over time. To be human is to be an image bearer of God. What did that look like in the half man, half ape, halfway there kind of state?
Yeah.
I have had one lecturer tell me that it was a group of early hominids that suddenly the image of God was pressed upon them or endowed to them.
So you have this like not human thing, and then God puts His image on it. Is that the idea?
Yeah, which I would see the image of God as intrinsic to being human, not something that's placed. You've got this biological being, and the image of God is imprinted on them. I would say to be human is to be an image bearer of God. It's not something that you can add on to any biological creature,
because in a sense it could be taken from. To a degree.
If it's external to it, it's separate to our being, then that's a massive problem. But I would say to be human is to be an image bearer of God. So. And probably the next big theological issue that I would have was related. It got me thinking about it when my lecturer was talking about this early group of hominids that became, image bearers of God. How did they get to this stage? Where did they all come from? And was it over millions of years of death and disease and destruction? And the biblical worldview says that death came into the world through sin, through the sin of Adam. And so any worldview where you have millions of years of death and disease. I mean, you can look at fossils that have cancerous tumors on them. You can see fossils of one fish eating another fish. It's not a pretty world out there. And the biblical worldview is that it was a perfect world created by a good God that has since been marred and ruined by sin. I know there's a wide variety of interpretations that we can touch on with Genesis, as far as theistic evolution or old Earth creationism or the day age, all those types of things, or gap theory, or all sorts of different things like that. Rather than tackling them one by one, I would say that when you look at the major theological truths that we learn from Genesis, I think that contradicts all of those other alternative positions. So when you look at, what it means to be created in the image of God, what it means for death to enter into the world because of sin, that's the thing that discounts and contradicts all of those other positions. So, anything that has millions of years of death, and they would interpret it differently. Some would say it was solely human death, not animal death.
Right, because I've heard, and maybe this takes us off course just a little bit, but I mean, like a seed falling into the ground and dying, is that death before?
Yeah, interesting. I would make a distinction between the animal kingdom and, say, plants, which were available for food. Sure. So is it actually alive in the it's alive in the sense that it's biological, but it's not alive in the same way as something that has the breath of life, like an animal or a person. Yeah. And my issue with reinterpreting death there are two things that they would reinterpret it as. One is it just means human death and not animal death, which I don't see that in say Romans 8, where Paul says that the whole creation is groaning.
Yep.
I mean, even it was funny the day that my lecturer was denying the existence of Adam and talking about, that it only means human death, not animal death. It was actually that night that my cat died, 19-year-old cat. And I'm sitting there going, so you're saying that God looks at this and says that it's very good.
Yeah.
And I look at it going, this is not the way the world's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And we long for a day in which the curse is removed and there's no more death.
Yeah.
And there'll be, I'm hoping, trees that taste like bacon or something. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but God can handle that. So, and so, there's the idea, the lion laying with the lamb. I don't believe there's going to be animal. The first animal death was when Adam and Eve sinned.
Yep.
They tried to cover up their sins, and then there was the shedding of blood to cover them. That was when animal death came into the world. And then the other thing they would do is say, well, it doesn't mean physical death; it just means spiritual death, and that's when they spiritually died. I take issue with that as well, because 1 Corinthians 15, talking about death being the last enemy that's destroyed. If the new heavens and new earth involves us still physically dying, well, then it's not much of a new heaven and new earth. I'm not looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So the hope that we have is that the curse that was placed on the world in Genesis is removed in Revelation when Jesus, he came to destroy death, and then when he returns, he'll abolish it once and for all. There will be a world with no more death, no more suffering, and I think that's the correct answer, the biblical answer to deal with suffering. And I've heard some apologists say, anyway. William Lane Craig was coming speaking in Adelaide. So I have great respect for him in a lot of different answers that he gives in a lot of different fields. I appreciate his answers, but he doesn't hold to a creationist position. So when he was asked about suffering, he gave a very philosophical answer. I won't do it justice. I won't try and repeat it all, but it was talking about, an infinite number of possible worlds, and, in each of those worlds there were different circumstances, and the world that God created here was the only world in which there could be, say, free will and a way in which he could display his attributes, and that happens to be a world in which suffering was necessary or something. It's a very philosophical kind of thing. And for me, I go, it's actually really simple. God didn't create a world with suffering.
Yeah.
Sin came into the world, stuffed it up, and that also means that we have hope for the future. Because if it was a world created because it was philosophically necessary, well, then does that mean that the new heaven and new earth, that might be a possibility? But we go, no, because there was a curse placed on because of the sin, and all according to his plan, there will be a new heaven and new earth. And that's just such a better, more comforting and intellectually satisfying and biblical answer to the issue of suffering than some kind of philosophical answer, which, if someone deals with a loved one, they've got a bad cancer diagnosis, I don't want to hear, some kind of philosophical, hypothetical situation. I want to know, why did this happen? Yeah. And it was C.S. Lewis said that, suffering is God's megaphone to a deaf world. We need to recognize this world isn't the way that it's supposed to be. And I think we all know that. We all know it's not. Even the atheists go, when they mock God and look at the suffering in the world, they're recognizing it shouldn't be this way. There shouldn't be kids starving and dying. Right. But the biblical worldview provides an answer as to why it happened, and it provides a solution through the gospel.
One thing that stands out to me in all of this, and one, I don't know if you have other things you want to add, but you've made this more interesting to me than we started. So there we go.
Okay.
But if you take I think a creationist approach to understanding Genesis, and you see like God in 6 days creating this perfect world for Adam and Eve to live in. And I do, thinking biblical theology wise, right? The story of the Bible begins in a beautiful garden, perfect world, and it ends in a beautiful garden in a perfect world. And so it's kind of odd, I guess, unless you're a post-millennialist, where you have like this evolutionary process to reach the new creation, why you'd have an evolutionary process to create the world.
Yeah, interesting.
When it's going to just, one day it's going to be here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sin and death are sin that leads to death is the main problem in tension within the whole, especially the Old Testament. And then you have Christ come, and that's what he does. He overcomes sin and death through his own suffering. And the resurrection then, which leads us into Easter coming up very soon here, and celebrating that idea that because Christ lives, we will live also, and we will experience that resurrection and life in the new creation, where there will be no more sin, no more death.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks, Matt, for all the work you did on this. You did a lot of. You said you suffered through a lot of Neil deGrasse Tyson videos before this, and so you took one for the team, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I know that our listeners are going to be helped and encouraged by this. So we do thank you for listening to the podcast, and we pray that this conversation, as well as any other conversation we have, would be helpful to the members of Calvary Bible Church, that we'd grow in maturity and in Christ-likeness. If you're a part of another church, though, we pray that this conversation also helps you serve faithfully there where the Lord has placed you. If you've enjoyed the podcast, we love getting ratings and reviews, as well as interacting with our listeners, just like we talked about at the beginning of the show. So let us know what you think. Send us topics to discuss or questions or comments you might have. The easiest way to get hold of us is if you're a part of our church, just to talk to us in person, give us a call or send us a text. Otherwise, you can email us at thecalvarycast@gmail.com. Follow us online on Instagram and X. We are at The Calvary Cast. At Calvary, we exist for the glory of God, the good of his people, and the Great Commission. Until next time.